first thing I want to say is that people from IR, political scientists, often talk about the hegemonic power and how the hegemon will try to create a regime, a global regime, where the trading system or any other type of system that's set up will primarily benefit the hegemon, but also to some extent the member states as an inducement to go along with the regime. So keep that in mind in the back of your heads, because the question that we have to address first is, well, how does the hegemon decide what he's going to do? And that's going to take us inside the state, which IR normally doesn't go. Fortunately, sociology does go inside the state. Well, if you look inside the state, and of course we all know that the current hegemon is the United States, what we have right now, I argue, and there are scholars like William Domhoff, C. Wright Mills, and a number of U.S. congressional committees, is that we have, on the one hand, a very class-conscious elite in the United States, or as Marx would call them, a class for themselves. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not saying this is organized in any very specific way. In fact, most of what I'm going to say to you is going to be very gray. It's give and take. It's in the process of. But there is an elite class that understands its interests, unlike maybe the working class that makes up a false class consciousness. And when I talk about the elite or the upper class, I'm using it synonymously with the corporations or the corporate class, because they are the owners of the corporations, especially when you look at who owns the majority of the stock in the United States. It's the elite, it's not the working class. It's amongst the corporate community. And they often form what we refer to as either direct or indirect interlocks. That is, they share common board of members of the board of directors. And although there's still competition in the corporate world, what these corporate interlocks do is reduce it or try to create somewhat of a common business agenda, but not just a common business agenda, but also a common political agenda. And again, we have U.S. congressional committees that have investigated this. So you do have a corporate, upper class, common class consciousness. And what happens is they take their wealth, and again, this is documented in many different sources. They take their wealth, and on the one hand, what they do is they try to influence policy formation through very deep funding of think tanks, policy groups, and so forth. And what most people don't realize is that a lot of these think tanks are not staffed necessarily by academics. They're often staffed by ideologues. And their work is published as soon as it's written up, without any peer review or anything. So here you have people with money influencing the kind of policy that's going to be formulated. Then on the other hand, and they often, by the way, staff these policy groups with their own members. On the other hand, you also have the use of their money to control the political process or the rule-making process. That's politics. Again, how? Through lobbying, which is a very big problem in the United States, through direct staffing. I mean, think about it. If you're Halliburton, wouldn't you like your CEO to be the vice president of the United States? And then what happens is that the people who are now responsible to pick policy and implement policy go where? To these think tanks, these institutions. They get the ready-made tailored policies given to them, and they implement them, often with little input from left groups or working class groups or representatives of the working class or labor. Now, this is a very dirty game, I would say, and the average person would say, hold on there, this doesn't sound right to me. You're creating the rules all by yourself here. But money helps again, because with money, you have media concentration and media control. Think Robert Murdoch, okay? So as long as you control the mass media, you can also reinforce the dominant ideology and legitimize it. And the fewer sources of independent information that you have, the less likely people are to challenge the existing relations. Now, this paper, I have to tell you, was going to be too big and I had to split it. And the second half, which is not going to be presented today, talks about the relations of production and how we have to challenge them with new ideologies. So here we have the legitimation process. Now let's go back to that hegemon. Because once you have control of the policy formation within the global hegemon, now you can move on and control the policy formation for the global structure. And here we have, at this time, an emergence of what I would believe to be a global SSA. I know somebody said there is no such thing, it's all nation-specific, and I agree, there are national SSAs. However, these national SSAs are superimposed by what I believe to be emerging global social structure of regulation. The first such structure is centered around the IMF and the World Bank. In other words, we're seeing the emergence of a global financial SSA. Now, this first SSA, the global financial SSA, centered around the IMF and the World Bank, has a number of purposes. The first one is to provide regulation of the financial system. And it's doing a relatively effective job. But there's more to it. Number one, these institutions have shifted their policies toward neoliberalization of global policy, as has been done within the United States. And what that basically means is privatization and capital mobility. And all you have to do is look at the IMF policies in terms of getting loans as a lender of last resort when you're a nation. They tell you have to privatize a lot of your services, and they tell you have to have free capital flows if you want IMF help or World Bank help. So here, this SSA, the global financial regime, is promoting mobility of capital, which allows you to take your money into a country. It's not just about taking money out of a country. You also want to put money into a country if you're going to invest. So one, you have mobility to invest in the poor nations. Secondly, you have the opportunity to repatriate profits that are going to be generated in these poor nations because you don't have capital controls anymore. Thirdly, you have the ability to discipline poor governments when they try to impose new regulations or increase their taxes on your corporation or what have you. So you can say, hey, you're not playing ball, I'll go to another poor country. I'm taking my capital out overnight. Just press a button, there go all those zeros. And fourth, and this is a bonus from this new global financial regime that's being established, fourth, you can play international accounting shell games. So what corporations do is they cook the books to show all of their profits generated in the nations with the lowest tax rates and all their losses in the nations with the highest tax rates. That's a little bonus that we get on the side. Now, the second major pillar of exploitation that I refer to is that of the emerging global trade regime centered around the WTO and various FTAs. And again, I'm going to show you something that you need to keep in mind as we go. It's going to make sense. When we had the original Fordist regime, or SSA, notice there were very few free trade agreements in the world. But as the old SSA started to crumble, look at what happened to the free trade agreements. They started increasing year by year. And of course, with the WTO in the mid-90s, they skyrocketed the number of FTA agreements. Now, what's the importance of this new SSA based on free trade, which, by the way, ironically, is not even free, and we'll get to that. Well, number one, you want the WTO and FTAs to provide you with dispute resolution mechanisms. And the jury is out as to whether they're very effective in providing dispute resolution. However, there's a more important role that this regime plays, and that is it allows corporations to move production into poor regions of the world. Why? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. And by the way, who gets the foreign direct investment? Because we are seeing, as the free trade agreements are increasing in number, FDI inflows into poor nations are also increasing, as FDI inflows into rich nations are decreasing. Who are the primary recipients? Countries with very big populations that are very poor, but with stable governments. Stability. And right now, Mexico and Brazil are not even really the countries of choice because, as we're going to see, they're too expensive. Now we're looking more and more toward India and China. And we're going there, obviously, for what? The cheap labor. In the United States, if you want to take a look here, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Okay, I guess we're going to have a little technical difficulties following us. But in the United States, a worker is going to make about $23 an hour, in Canada about 21, versus a Brazilian that makes 3 or a Mexican that makes about 2.5. So why would I want to build a new Ford plant in America or Canada when I can build it in Mexico with NAFTA at $2.50 an hour? And notice that when NAFTA was passed in '94, wages didn't go up. We were told they were going to go up. They didn't. They stayed flat. Okay? So guess what? That's not good enough. That's too expensive. Why would I have $2? My God, that's a lot of money. Why do I want to pay $2? These are the typical wages for apparel workers in factories in various parts of the world. How about a penny in Bangladesh? Penny an hour. How about 50 cents for apparel workers in Mexico? Or 24 in Romania? Maybe Sri Lanka. Indonesia, 10 cents.
I can't read the small print, but what is the source of this
This is the National Labor Committee. It's
yes, and do you know the source of their data?
well, they actually go themselves directly into these countries, and they do a hands-on.
Yes, I heard Charlie, and I'm not sure I trust
Yes,
it.
they collect the data themselves.
Yes.
They actually go to these countries and talk directly to the workers and get the pay stubs. So this is as close as you can get to practical, hands-on collection of data from the National Labor Committee.
Charlie's a very effective advocate.
Now, obviously, the production that's moving into these countries has to be able to come back out. That's, again, the role of the WTO and the FTAs. Because clearly, the people that are making a penny an hour, or $2 an hour, cannot afford to buy a Ford automobile or a flat-screen TV. So this is all intended to come back where? Into the world consumption regions, so the United States, Japan, and Europe. And that's shown, the numbers are a little small here, but again, this is from the U.S. Trade Bureau. The numbers show that as the FTAs were increasing, look at the trade deficit of the United States, ballooning. Because this is showing that all these goods are coming right back to be consumed in the countries that have the wages to buy them. They're not made to be consumed in the countries where they were produced. So that's the benefit of the WTO and FTA. However, these two SSAs on finance and trade would be meaningless without the third and most important new global SSA, which is based on a global labor accord with totally defeated labor. So we have an emerging global SSA based on internationally segmented labor. In other words, we have regions of authoritarian production, such as in China, India, where the labor conditions are that of 1800s England, if not worse. And then we have a region of democratic consumption in the Western nations that are supposed to buy these products. And the beauty of this system with internationally segmented labor is that obviously trade is not free. Because according to classical economics, if you're going to have free trade, okay, it's not going to be just free trade of products, which means that you get international prices down. This is the international price for copper, for steel, for whatever, an equilibrium price. Well, you should have seen that for labor as well. The cost of labor in high labor cost countries should have come down as wages would be increasing in low-wage countries. We're not seeing that. Why? Because people are not allowed movement. That's not free trade. People are forced to stay in countries as cheap serf labor. They can't move out. They have to stay there. Okay? And as far as the wages go for the developed nations, you can discipline your labor forces with the threat of outsourcing. And now more and more people, especially in the United States, are contingent workers. You don't like what we give you. You don't want to give us cutbacks. You don't want to give us your pensions back, whatever. No problem. We'll go to Indonesia. We'll go somewhere else. So you have a disciplining of labor in both parts of the world. And that brings us back to that argument of a core-periphery divide. You have to have segmented labor. The core of labor and the periphery. Now, this is all reflected, and again, I apologize for this, it's reflected in the declining GDP rates that we've been seeing. If you were able to see on this side, we'd see that in the United States, as well as the other countries, as the free trade regimes have been increasing, the number of it. I'm trying, but if I move the mouse, it's going to, oh, there we go, thanks.
Yeah.
See, it takes me to the other. And I can't see my screen here to click back, that's the problem.
Page up.
Page up.
Okay. There we go. Now, I did this based on per capita because I think that's a little bit more accurate in terms of population changes, the growth of population. So if we look here, since the 1990s, the real GDP rate, and this is comparable because it's purchasing power parities, it's very small. And that's because production is increasingly moving outside of these developed nations. And that's reflected, I believe, in GDP rates. Now, of course, there's a lot that's related to why we have trade deficits, a lot related to why this is falling. But I'm trying to paint a very broad picture here. Now, in turn, what we're seeing is increasing inequality in developed nations. This is the Gini coefficient. And you can see that the bigger the Gini number is, the more inequality you have. And this is for the United States. And as free trade has been increasing, and internationally segmented labor has become more of a daily phenomenon, so has inequality increased. And not only is inequality increasing, because you can say if it's a bigger pie, inequality may not matter that much. It's a smaller piece, but of a much larger pie. But if you were to look at economic data, whether it's from the Economic Policy Institute and other sources, wages, also developed nations, have been flat. They have not been going up. And you have increasing inequality, which is also shown by the income shares that people receive.
Sorry, where are these?
This is for the United States, and these are basically, this is all data from the United States government. Did I go up too high? Oh well. So you have income shares that are declining for the bottom 80% of the population. Now, if people don't have the ability to buy what corporations are selling, I believe that's also going to be reflected in corporate profit rates. And it's been calculated, and I have the source here, that as the old SSA has been declining, corporate profit rates have been declining as well. But I would say this is not because of competition alone. I would say it's because of inadequate aggregate demand, because of inadequate purchasing power. That's what's creating this fall in profit rates, at least to some extent.
I'd be suspicious of those figures.
Well,
I don't know how they would referee an article.
well, the data itself from the article came from business.
Yeah, well, that's not.
Well, again, I'm just trying to paint a very broad picture here. But let me put one more down. So what we're seeing is that we have outsourcing into world production regions where people cannot really afford to buy the products they're making. And then we're having all this product come back into the developed region to be consumed. Now the problem here is you're going to say to me that, well, John, this is all fine and dandy, but how do you know that the Chinese consumer is not necessarily going to consume the products they're making? Well, in addition to not making a lot of money, for example, it's been calculated that the Chinese worker makes about 50 to 60 cents an hour. What we're seeing is that corporations are keeping the benefits of globalization and increased productivity all to themselves. It's not like it's being shared in another part of the world. Why? I'll give you one example, again, from the National Labor Committee. A pair of Puma sneakers in the United States will sell for about $70. From that, the company gets about $34 in profit. However, these sneakers are produced in Puyan, China, for about $1.16. It takes $1.16 to produce that pair of sneakers. So clearly, the Chinese worker is not getting much of that benefit in wages, and neither is the consumer getting much of that benefit in lower consumer prices. Most of that benefit from globalization is being kept by the corporation itself. So the Chinese worker or the Indian worker may not be able to clear the markets with all that's being produced. So off it goes here. And again, you're going to say to me, well, again, John, you got a problem because the economy is working. We're not seeing the markets collapse or anything. That's the problem. Well, the problem is that the markets are clearing, but the problem is how they're clearing. And the way that they're clearing is through debt. Now, I know that that can be debated in terms of, is it the upper class that's really purchasing everything or not? But think about what's coming into this country, into Europe, into America from China. It's not mansions. What we're importing is what? Shoes, flat screen TVs, basic consumer products, things that the average Joe is going to have to buy. Because Bill Gates is not going to want 5,000 flat screen TVs. Maybe 100, but not 5,000 or 20 billion units. And most of the global goods are in fact consumed by the richest 20% of the world's population, which, not surprisingly, would be located where? United States, Japan, America. But how are these people consuming? It's been shown that, at least in the United States, people are consuming based on debt. And here I have some various figures for you. And here's the problem. What happens if you can't pay your debt? What happens if you're downsized? What happens if, let's say, your home value goes down, if there's a market crash? Because I understand that there's good debt and there's bad debt. But Americans now, what they've done actually, and what the argument of Light and Fitzgerald was, is that the middle class in the 70s realized that its income was not growing sufficiently to keep up the living standards that we've been accustomed to in the United States that we call a middle class living standard. So what they did is they started taking out, using credit, taking out loans from credit cards. And you see at about that time, the increase in credit card debt in the United States. In other words, the middle class has been using credit cards as a source of income. Well, the problem is you got to pay that back. And at some point, credit cards get maxed out. Then what? Then you go to what? Home equity loans. Now you can say to me, look, if I got a home equity that it went from $500,000 to $1 million, that's a good thing. I'm not that poor. I can afford to use my home equity. Well, yeah, but that's illusory. That's an illusion. Because if you don't sell your home, you don't have that money. And what if your home value goes down? The debt doesn't disappear. It stays there. And what if your home value stays fixed? It doesn't increase. Then you can't keep taking money out. But you still have to pay the interest on what you owe. And even more scarier, household debt as a percentage of after-tax income. Look at what it was in the 1950s versus now. So my point is that if we come
hit
to
120% in 2005.
and over 100% in 2005. So what I'm trying to say is that the emerging global SSA is extremely efficient when it comes to production. It's very good when it comes to creating global commodity chains and efficiencies and so forth. But there's a problem. Capitalism to work relies not just on production, but consumption as well. And I think that we have restated here the classic problem of overproduction and consumption. Because what happens when people cannot afford to buy these products when there's no more credit? Then we have stagnation. And we don't have, as we did in the past, in the Fordist era, an SSA regime for consumption. That has been neglected. And that's going to be the ultimate problem. Now, why, in conclusion, well, before I tell you this, what would be some solutions? Well, one solution would be to engage in Keynesian spending if we want to stimulate the economy and so forth. But as a lot of you have said, that's probably not going to be in the cards. Another solution is to re-regulate the economy to balance the problem of a profit squeeze when labor has the upper hand, or the problem of inadequate aggregate demand when capital has the upper hand, as Marty was saying to us. So re-regulate the balance of power between capital and labor. But again, that's not going to be a permanent solution. Why? Because things do change. The other problem, and this is why I call the paper an Anarcho-SSA analysis versus a Marxist analysis, is that in a democracy, when somebody can spend their money any way they want, guess who's going to have more power and influence over the government? He who has the money and therefore can use his money to make the rules. So government is not necessarily going to be your ally. And what is the problem, ultimately, at the fundamental level? Private property. And that's the elephant in the room. When somebody controls everything, they have all the private property, then obviously they're going to win in this conflict. And nobody really wants to address the issue of private property and how we may have to change our political economic organization of society. And to conclude, I would say we need to go back to basics. Sociological theory 101. Relations of production, forces of production, mode of production. Well, today they're based on what? The mode of production. Capitalist private property rights. Mode of distribution, based on politics and power, money. Mode of consumption. If you have money to buy what you want from the markets, then yes, otherwise no. What I believe is that we have to look more seriously at the possibility of engaging in what anarchists would call direct action to change what? The relations of production. We have to start talking about the possibility of moving on to some new epoch. And that cannot happen if we all take capitalism for granted and that it can never change. We have to understand that at some point, somebody went up to the feudal lord and said, you know what? I don't want these guys to be serfs. I want them to be able to go to my factory. Well, today nobody's saying these things. Today everybody's saying, well, capitalism, you have to be a little naive to say we're going to end capitalism, private property is going to be taken away, and the power corporation is going to be managed. Well, maybe we have to start thinking this, because I don't see any other way that we're going to have a future without these perpetual problems of boom and bust. They're always with us. And that was pretty much the general point that I was trying to make with this paper.